Maybe you grew up in church and you know the story of Joseph. Maybe you didn't. But a lot of people know that Joseph was given a coat of many colors by his father because his father loved him. And this week, we're talking about relationships, and we're talking about dysfunctional families and awkward family relationships and awkward family moments. And so I thought it fitting that we read one of the greatest passages that deals with a dysfunctional family. Because if there was ever a dysfunctional family, it was this family. First of all, they had 12 boys, all right? So you could see it was tough. And on top of that, mom and dad had favorites. And on top of that, it was a blended family, and there were favorites going on. And so there was a lot of wrestling, fighting, and jealousy between the brothers. And that was as a result of what the parents did by handing out favoritism to individuals. And you know the story of Joseph if you grew up in Sunday school. He didn't really make things easy on himself. He would tell his brothers, one day, I'm going to rule over you. I saw it in a dream. No brother wants to hear that, especially from their littlest brother, okay? So they would be a punk. They were quite a bit older than him. They weren't 3 or 4 years older. Some of them were 10, 15, 20 years older than Joseph. And so one day they had just had enough. Here he comes, walking towards them. Dad has given him an agenda. Go make sure they're doing what they're supposed to. And they see him coming in that coat of many colors that was expensive. And they think, why does Dad buy him the Jordans? Why does Dad buy him the nice pants, the nice clothes? Why does Dad do everything for him? It's high time we taught him a lesson. And so they throw him in a pit. And some of them say, we're going to kill him. And there's a lot of brothers that you don't need to know all the names, but there's Reuben, there's Naphtali, there's Dan, there's Simeon. But Reuben's the oldest. And unlike most of the oldest brothers that you find in this situation, he is kind of trying to be a leader, but he's not a good leader. He said, don't kill him, just throw him in the pit. Well, and he's going to go back and he's going to try to rescue him, but nobody listens to Reuben. But when Judah speaks up, everybody pays attention. Judah is not the oldest. He's not the second oldest. He's down the line a little bit. Judah says, no, let's not kill him. I see some merchantmen coming. Let's sell our brother. Let's make some money. Let's make this worth our while. And Judah knew full well when he did that, what that meant. There would be no recourse. This isn't 2015. This isn't 2016 where we have smartphones where we can get up with people. Once you sold him into slavery, there would be no way to track down where he ended up and who owned him and where he was. But all the brothers, when Judah spoke, they listened. And so they handed him over, got a few pieces of silver. They're a wealthy family. They didn't need this money. And they sold him into slavery. And from that point forward, you know the story of Joseph. He goes to work for Potiphar and things don't work out. He gets accused. He's lied about. He's thrown in prison and things get worse and worse for Joseph. And in Sunday school, I was taught the story of Joseph. What a story of somebody who always does what's right when he's thrown in prison, who always does what's right when people lie about him. And Joseph is such a good role model, and he absolutely is. But what happens is we don't read what happened to Judah during that period of time. Let me tell you what happened to Judah. His life got worse too. Because from that day forward, he made stupid decision after bad decision after unwise decision. He thought by getting rid of Joseph, his dad would grieve for a little bit and he would get over it. But they brought that coat of many colors covered in blood to his dad. And his dad grieved and he continued to grieve. And in the passage we're going to read in a second, we're going to find out that his dad reminds him often that it was on your watch, Judah, that my favorite son went missing and we assume he's dead. And for the rest of his life with his dad's pointing at him, saying, it was you. I know you are the one in charge. I know you are the one your brothers trust. And what he thought would go away in 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, for decades, his dad holds a grudge against him for what happened. And so he gets a little discouraged, a little depressed, and he begins to make really unwise decisions. He's caught with a prostitute that's later discovered to be his daughter-in-law who has tricked him. That's embarrassing. His sons are so wicked, they're considered two of the wickedest men on the planet. And day after day, when he comes to his family, because their family was big and they would gather, he knew that he was a failure. And he knew he had let his dad down. He knew he'd let his family down. And he knew he let his brothers down. Because I would bet that his brothers would come to him often and say, Dad is still grieving over what you said to do. We all know what you did. And so in the passage we're about to read, we find a Judah who's quite a bit older. While Joseph has gone through prison and gone through trials, and later we know he's now the second in command in Egypt. And when this famine not only hits Egypt, but hits the whole globe and the entire world is hungry, God has seen fit to put a man in Egypt named Joseph who can provide for not only Egypt. The whole world begins to travel to Egypt to buy this food that they've had in store because they had 7 years of plenty and they saved and saved. And the famine not only hits Egypt, it hits where Judah, where Jacob, their father, where all of these guys are. And Judah gets an idea. He and his brothers, they go to their dad and they say, Dad, we're going to starve to death if we continue to just deal with this famine on our own. We've got some money. We've got some goods. They do us no good at this point. We need to go to Egypt. We hear there's a man there who can give us goods to provide for us, and we can be fed. And so Judah gets his posse together, all of his brothers. But I remind you, there were 10 brothers through one wife, but the other wife, Jacob had 2 sons, Joseph and Benjamin. And Judah says, Dad, we'll go. All the guys, we're going to go. We're going to get food. And Judah's saying, this is one time I can make the family proud. I'll go provide food and I'll save our family. Their family's big. At this point, Judah not only has kids, he probably has grandkids. So if you have 11 guys with kids and grandkids, and a lot of them have servants and workers, we're talking about hundreds, maybe thousands of people that are depending on Judah to go to Egypt, to get food, and to save the day. And he has not saved the day up to this point. He's been a failure. So there's a little bit of him, I'm sure, that wants to make Dad proud, wants to make the family proud. So he heads to Egypt, and he goes before this man that he does not recognize, that speaks a different language, but is actually his brother Joseph. And when Joseph hears them speaking in the tongue that he was raised in, the language he was raised in, his ears perk up. And he doesn't tell him who he is. He begins asking questions. He says, oh, there's 10 of you. How cool. A big, huge family of 10 brothers. How neat. Are there any others? And Judah, always speaking for the boys, says, yeah, one went missing, weird story. And then there's another youngest, but he's my dad's favorite. And Joseph does something. He says, shut it down. Don't give them any more food. Your money's no good here. You go back to your father, and you tell him, unless you bring that other brother, that Benjamin you speak of, I will give you no food. Joseph's got a plan of what he's going to do, and Judah knows this isn't good. So Judah imagined he would take that couple-day journey back to where he was from and be celebrated and hailed when he got back with all that food, but he came back empty-handed. He comes back with his head hanging low, and he goes to his dad, and he says, Dad, they're not going to give us food. He says, why not? He says, they're not going to give us food unless we take Benjamin with us. And his dad says, no. Judah says, I know, Dad. And his dad reminds him. He reminds him, he says, Judah, it was on your watch that Joseph went missing all those years ago. Don't do this. And Judah and his dad enter a pact. It'd be like a swear or a promise or a contract. They sit down and they put their hands on each other's thighs. And this is a death oath, basically. And Judah looks in his dad's eyes and he says, Dad, I promise on my life, I will not let you down. I will bring back Benjamin if I leave everyone else. And his dad looks him in the eyes and says, if you come back without Benjamin, I will die of a broken heart at the sight. So they go back to Egypt. They stand before Joseph, and everything seems to go well. Joseph hasn't revealed who he is. He says, oh, this is Benjamin? Cool. Give them their food. And they load up bags and bags and stockpiles of food, enough to take back and save the family for an extended period of time. And I can see Judah, right? Everything he's done to this point has failed, but this one, it's working out. And they start to head out of Egypt. They've got their carts, they've got their animals loaded with food, and every step they take away from Egypt, Judah's got to be thinking, I did it. I made it. Benjamin is still with me. I have every brother accounted for. I am finally going to make it up to Dad. But then they hear something. They hear horses. They hear chariots. They hear men of war behind them. They encircle them, and they tell them, someone has stolen our leader's jeweled cup. And Judah says, that's silly. We gave you money. We don't need jewels. We need food. You can check every bag. And so they do. They start off at the top with Reuben, the oldest, and they open his bag. They search through the grain. They search through the food. And Judah's probably thinking, man, Reuben's kind of stupid. I wonder if he did it. No, he didn't do it. Okay. They go to Dan's bag. He says, I never really liked Dan. Maybe Dan did. Not Dan's bag. They go to Naphtali. They go to Simeon. They go to Judah's bag. They go all the way down. And they get to the last bag. Now, Benjamin didn't steal that cup. Joseph has set all of this up. And not in a vengeful way, I want you to understand. And they reach into Benjamin's bag and they pull out this cup. And Judah knows. Gig's up. Doesn't matter if Benjamin took it, doesn't matter if I took it, doesn't matter who did it. We're done. They're carried back before this leader. And Judah has an opportunity that is very rare in this life. He gets a second try at a big decision that I want to read you to. Here's the thing. If I asked you if there was something you'd like to go back and do, I think all of us, there's a day, there's a moment, there's a conversation, there's a reaction we had that if we could just go back, we'd redo it. And in this moment, Judah is going to redo one of the hardest moments of his life. Look at Genesis chapter 44. And we'll begin reading in verse 16. I'm going to read, then we're going to talk. I'm going to read. We're going to annotate this as we go because this is a powerful passage. So look what Judah says. Then Judah said, what shall we say to my Lord? What shall we speak? Or how shall we clear ourselves? He says, I know. And here's the thing. He's got to be thinking to himself, we didn't do this, but he doesn't care. He just knows there's no clearing their name. God has found out the iniquity of Benjamin. No, he doesn't blame Benjamin. Of your servants. He says it's all of us. I will take the blame for all of these guys. Of your servants. Both we and he also with whom the cup was found. He said, far be it from me that I should do so. This is Joseph. He says, no. Hey, no sweat, Judah, you didn't do it. Dan didn't do it. Reuben didn't do it. Just that youngin', man. I would never hold you accountable for what he did. He said, the man in whose hand the cup was found, he shall be my slave. As for you, go in peace to your father. Go home. The same thing you did to me, you could do it to Benjamin. Sell him into slavery, look out for yourself, and go home and forget about it. Judah's been dealing with the consequences of that moment for years. He doesn't want that to happen again. So this next portion is really good. Look what Judah says. Then Judah came near. He says, hold up. Everybody else, listen, dude. He comes up close to his ear. He says, I'm going to tell you something. I'm going to pour my heart out to you. He says, oh, my Lord, please let your servant speak a word in my Lord's hearing and do not let your anger burn against your servant. He says, don't be mad, dude. He says, I know that you are like Pharaoh. I know that you are powerful. Verse 19. My Lord, you asked his servant, saying, have you a father or a brother? He says, bro, you did this, okay? You asked me if I had a brother, and he rehearses the whole thing to him. He says, you asked me if I had a brother, and I told you I did. But then you said you want to see my brother, and I told you that my father loves this boy, and his life is wrapped up in this boy. And if I bring him here and anything happens to him, my father will never forgive me. But look at verse 23. But you said to your servants, unless your youngest brother comes down with you, you shall see my face no more. You gave me an ultimatum. You made me bring this kid here. I know what he's done is wrong, but you made me bring him. Verse 4. So it was when we went up to your servant, my father, we told him the words. I told him what you said. Verse 25. And our father said, go back and buy us a little food. But we said, we cannot go. We cannot go down. If our youngest brother is with us, then we will go down. For we may not see the man's face unless our youngest brother is with us. Verse 27. Then your servant, your servant, my father said to us, you know that my wife gave me 2 sons. And the one went out from me, and I said, surely he is torn to pieces, and I have not seen him since. He tells Judah the same thing he's been telling him for years. You remember there were 2 through my first wife. You remember that she gave me 2 sons. Verse 27. 29. But if you take this one also from me, and calamity befalls him, you shall bring down my gray hair with sorrow to the grave. Now therefore, when I come to your servant my father, and the lad is not with me, since his life is bound up in the lad's life, it will happen that when he sees that the lad is not with us, he will die. It says, if you make me go home without my brother, my dad will die at the sight of 10 of us instead of 11. Verse 32, for your servant became surety. That's that oath. That's that swearing, that leg promise. I became surety for the lad to my father, saying, if I do not bring him back to you, then I shall bear the blame before my father forever. Verse 33 is so beautiful. Would you read it with me? Now, therefore, please let your servant, let me remain instead of the lad as a slave to my Lord, and let the lad go up with his brothers. For how shall I go up to my father if the lad is not with me? Lest perhaps I see the evil that would come upon my father. I don't need to see my wife. I don't need to see my kids. I don't need to see my family ever again. I would rather stay here with you than go back and break my dad's heart one more time. At this point, I've been nothing but a failure. It would be better for me to never see his face again and do one thing right than to accept your offer of freedom in exchange for his. This is take 2 all these years later, and he nails it. This is exactly what Joseph wanted to hear. In the next chapter, Joseph is so overcome by love and compassion and just pure emotion. He bans every Egyptian from the room. He says, get out, get out, get out. And he reveals himself to his brothers. And they said the crying was so loud in the next chapter that all of that city heard him crying. The groan of decades being separated from his family, the groan of grief, the groan of, just joy at what his brother has just done. And he tells his brothers, I've got great news. You're not staying here, you're all going home. And you're getting dad and you're bringing him back and we're going to live here. And I'm going to take care of you. What you thought for evil, God thought for good. I was placed here to not only look out for you, but to look out for this country. And countries all around the world are depending on this food source. God knew it. Judah's relieved. He goes back and he tells his dad, not only is Benjamin okay, we found Joseph. And they all come back. Here's what I want you to understand. There was a turning point in Judah's story. There are 2 truths I want you to take away this morning very quickly. First of all, there's got to come a point, there's got to come a day, there's got to come a moment where you care more about the family, you care more about others than yourself. Judah said, I will give my life. I just don't want to displease my father one more time. You want to know how to make it through family drama? This family had drama. They had decades of family drama. They were selling each other. They were not looking out for one another. And do you know how they got through it? There came a point where they cared more about what was right for the family than being right. Judah didn't take it. Judah didn't do it. He could have absolutely walked away and said, I'm doing what's right, but he was looking out for the betterment of the family, the betterment of the relationship, and the betterment of his brothers. Listen to me, people. I know what you're thinking. You don't know what my family's going through. You don't know what we've been through. You don't know the drama. I know. But there's got to come a point where some of us put our pride aside and say, I know I'm right, but it doesn't matter. I know she did me wrong, but I'm going to forgive her. I know he's been running his mouth about me, but we are family and we are going to work our way through this. That is the moment where healing begins. And it took this family a long time to get there, but they got there. And it started with Judah. There's better news than that. Let me tell you the rest of the story. When people in this time period were going to pass away, they would call together their family, their sons, this father specifically. He would call his sons in, and he would give them a final blessing. It wasn't just, giving them the money that they were going to inherit. It was speaking some truth into their life. He would call them in, and he would look them in the eyes, and he would be like, I've watched you for 50 years. I've watched you for 40 years, and this is what you're good at, and this is what you need to work on, and this is how God is going to use you, and this is where God needs to work in you so that he can work through you. And so in Genesis chapter 49, Jacob's going to do that for his kids. Turn there with me. Genesis chapter 49. We're going to read starting in verse 1. Jacob is older now. Let me give you some good news. We heard this story about Joseph growing up, and we think, oh man, he's sold at age 17, right? And then he doesn't see his family for all that time. Poor Joseph. Yes, poor Joseph. But here's the great news. Did you know that Joseph actually spent a lot more time with his family than without his family? He was sold into slavery at age 17. By age 30, he was made overseer of Egypt. At age 39, 7 years of famine of good, then 2 years of famine, his brothers come. So he's 39 years old. So he spent 22 years separated from his father and separated from his family. However, he gets another 17 years with his dad after that. So he spends 34 years of his life with his dad. And yes, 22 separated. But the back end, he gets to see his father and his family and take care of them. Jacob, he's getting ready to die. This is years later. Calls them in. Read verse 1. And Jacob called his sons and said, gather together that I might tell you what shall befall you in the last days. Let me tell you what's going to happen to you. Gather together and hear, you sons of Jacob, and listen to Israel, your father. And when they gather, they already know. There have been some good years the last couple years, but we did some bad stuff. And I wonder if dad is going to remember. I wonder if he's going to hold it against us. And so the first one to go in is Reuben, and they say, let's see what he says to Reuben. Reuben goes in. Read verse 3. Reuben, you are my firstborn, my might, and the beginning of my strength, the excellency of my dignity and the excellency of power. And they say, oh man, maybe he's going to be good. Maybe he forgot about everything. Verse 4. Unstable as water, you will not excel. You will fail. Can you imagine if your dad was on his deathbed? He said, come close. Come close. You're going to fail at everything you do. That's brutal. It gets worse. It gets worse. Read verse 5. Simeon and Levi are brothers. Instruments of cruelty are in their dwelling place. Let not my soul, I don't want to be around you. Let not my soul enter their counsel. Let not my honor be united to their assembly. I don't want to be associated with you. At this point in the story, Jacob knows the whole story of Judah selling Joseph. Jacob knows the whole story of Judah hiding it for 2 decades. And so Judah, he's got to be thinking, 1 was bad, 2 and 3 were awful. I'm next. I can just picture Judah walking in there with his head down, shoulders shrugged. But notice what his dad says in verse 8. Judah, you are he whom your brothers shall praise. And Judah's thinking, you mean Joseph? No. Judah, your hand shall be on the neck of your enemies. Your father's children shall bow down before you. No, that was Joseph's dream. Right. And that's already come true, Judah. You bowed down before Joseph when you bought that food. His dream has been fulfilled. I'm speaking something into your life. Read verse 9. Judah is a lion's whelp. From the prey, my son, you have gone up. He bows down, he lies down as a lion, and as a lion, who shall rouse him? Verse 10, the scepter shall not depart from Judah. Don't miss that. Every king of Jerusalem, every king of Israel, from this point forward, down the road, is going to come from one line, the line of Judah, the Lion of Judah, the king from Judah, the great line that not only would every scepter come from, keep reading, nor a lawgiver from between his feet until Shiloh comes. Now this is Old Testament. This is Hebrew writing, but this is a foreshadowing of Jesus Christ. And to him shall the obedience, another translation would be the gathering of all the people. Judah, there will be a Savior that will come one day. He won't come through Dan's line. He won't come through Joseph's line, not even Benjamin's line. He will come through your line, Judah. And Judah messed up, man. He screwed up time and time again, but when the moment was right, he made up for it. And here's what you've got to understand. This is the second truth from today's passage that you've got to get a hold of. Please don't miss this. Your past, your failures in the past, your past does not determine your future. Judah had messed up, but his future was bright. Why? Because through his line, through his sons, through his grandsons, through his great long-distance relatives, a Jesus Christ would be born that would be the gathering, the obedience, that is the worship of all people would be directed his way. Here's the great news. God can use the most messed up, vilest, and ridiculous story to honor himself. He did it through Judah. He would continue to do it through the Old Testament. He would do it in the New Testament, and he does it in 2016. It does not matter where you've been or what you've done. When Jesus is in your story, that is what makes the difference. And Judah is no longer remembered for all those things I mentioned to you earlier. Do you know why we're not taught about that in Sunday school? Because that's not the most important part of Judah's story. The most important part of Judah's story is he got it right, he did right, and the Son of God was born through his line. Almost as if it never happened. And the only reason I told you this morning that it happened was so we could wonder and revel in the grace of God to use someone so far from him to do something so important to him. I know. We're talking about family relationships. And I know that some of us have a pretty shattered past with people we should be close to. Maybe it's your son, your daughter, your niece, your nephew, your sister, your brother, your mom, your dad. Here's my encouragement to you. Whether it's 10 years of fighting, 2 decades of fighting, or 2 decades of hiding secrets from one another, like this family. Just because it's been this way this long doesn't mean you can't find healing in your family from this point forward. But it all goes back to that first truth. There's got to come a point where you're willing to be wrong. You're willing to let it go. You're willing to be the bigger person. And like every Sunday, I would be remiss not to mention this at the end. I want you to have a great relationship with your family. That's why we're doing a relationship series, and that's why we're talking about families this morning. I want your family to look like this family. I want it to go from dysfunctional and fighting and all the things that it may be right now to what a beautiful story at the end of grace. You know, Joseph never avenged himself on his brothers for those years. Never did. His brothers got along from that day forward. But most importantly, I want you to know this. More than I want your family to get along, more than I want you to be the bigger person, I want you to get that this story ends with Jesus. That's where every message here is going to end. That's where your story, your new story, can begin. Jesus is not just a nice little bow we put on the end of a story like that to make it good. Jesus is the difference in this story. Jesus is the grace. Jesus is the hope, the joy. Jesus is what people have been looking for on this planet since the beginning of time. And it was through Judah's line that God said, I will send that Messiah. Now we're on the other side of it. When Judah heard those words, it was almost like picturing something that hadn't happened yet. It was hard to envision. And sometimes what's bad is we are 2,000 years removed on the other side, and it's just the same. We sit here, and it's hard to imagine a Jesus walking around. It's hard to imagine him performing miracles, him bringing back people from the dead, and it's really hard to imagine him dying on a cross and then walking out of the tomb 3 days later so that he could forgive us for our sin. That's hard to imagine. But just like Judah had a hard time imagining it and it happened, we're going to have a hard time imagining it. But it happened. It is there. It is in the middle. It is actually what our history is divided on. 2,000 years later, our calendars work around that central theme. Somewhere in history, there was a dude named Jesus. And unlike everyone else who was ever born, he did something so memorable, they changed the calendars around the time that he was born, died, crucified, and rose from the grave. Because he was unlike any other human. He was unlike any any other person claiming to be God. He lived it. He conquered death, and he did it to show us there is more to life than this. There is more to life than just fearing death all these years, accumulating wealth, accumulating relationships, accumulating success, and then wondering what happens to it after we leave this planet. There is something beyond the grave, and he came to show us what that was. And if you've never had a relationship with Jesus, you're missing out, not only on eternity's side, but here. You're missing out here. The promise, the hope, the joy of knowing that I have something greater than this life could ever afford. And also the promise that God is not only for me, he's in my corner, but he has worked it out to where even when bad things happen, according to what Paul said in Romans, that God works it out for good. When bad things happened to Joseph, God was working it out for good. No matter what you do, no matter what someone else does to you, God can work it out for good. In Judges, when Samson turned his back on the promises God had made him and went out of his way to get into trouble, there's this word, there's this moment, this scripture where it says that God was going to redeem it. It wasn't that God willed it. It was that even in Samson's mistakes, God worked out a way to glorify himself. Don't come into church and look at your past and just feel the weight, the guilt, the shame, the regret. That's fine to feel, but once you find Jesus, you are released of that shame, you are released of that guilt, you are released of that weight because you're not accountable for it anymore. Jesus died so that we didn't have to live according to our past, but to what God has called into our life in the future. I'm not bound by what I've done, by what I did. I am bound by what Jesus has promised. I am his. I'm a son. I'm a child of God. So if you're here and you don't know this Jesus, here's the great news. Everyone here that does know him, there's nothing they love more than to see you get to know him this morning. That is what we are all about. So I'm going to ask it one more time, and then we're going to pray. Do you know this Jesus? Do you know this joy, this hope, this peace that can only come from being forgiven, from being filled with grace where sin once abounded? If you don't, I want to invite you to get to know him. Pray with me.